In the bitter winter of 1849, 14-year-old Emma Fitzgerald convinced an entire Massachusetts town that she could speak with the dead. For 3 harrowing months, desperate families lined up outside the modest Irish Catholic church in Millbrook, clutching silver coins and tear-stained letters, begging the pale girl with haunting green eyes to deliver messages from their departed loved ones. What they didn't know was that Emma's extraordinary gift came from a source far more sinister than divine intervention. It would destroy not just their victims' faith, but their will to live. The records of what really happened in that remote New England village were buried by church authorities for over a century, hidden away in sealed archives that tell a story of manipulation, betrayal, and a darkness that consumed an entire community from within. Before we continue with the story of Emma Fitzgerald and the most diabolical religious fraud in American history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these forgotten tales of American darkness. But Emma's story begins not with miracles, but with careful preparation that had been years in the making. The story begins in the harsh winter of 1849, when Irish immigrants were still fighting for acceptance in Protestant-dominated New England. Millbrook, Massachusetts, was a mill town of barely 800 souls, nestled between frozen streams that powered the textile factories, where most residents earned their meager living. The constant clatter of machinery echoed through the valley from dawn to dusk, mixing with the bitter wind that carried the acrid smell of dye and wool processing. Snow lay thick on the ground for months, turning the narrow dirt roads into treacherous paths of mud and ice that isolated the community from the outside world. The town had grudgingly accepted St. Bridget's Catholic Church 5 years earlier, mainly because Father Cornelius Fitzgerald had arrived with enough gold coins to purchase the abandoned Presbyterian meeting house outright. The transaction had raised eyebrows among the Protestant establishment, who wondered how a simple Irish priest had acquired such wealth. But desperation for any religious presence in their isolated community had overcome their suspicions. Father Fitzgerald was a man of imposing presence, tall and lean, standing well over 6 feet, with silver-streaked hair that caught the light like spun metal, and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. His voice carried the musical lilt of County Cork, but there was something carefully controlled about his accent, as if he had deliberately cultivated a more refined version of his native brogue. He had emigrated from Ireland with his brother's family after the devastating potato blight, carrying papers that established his ordination and a mysterious iron-bound trunk that never left his private chambers in the rectory. The townspeople respected him, if not for his faith, then for his uncanny ability to provide comfort during their darkest hours. When cholera swept through the mill workers' tenements the previous summer, Father Fitzgerald had moved among the sick with apparent fearlessness, administering last rites and carrying messages between dying parents and their children. When the Brennan family lost their eldest son in a mill accident, the priest had somehow known exactly what words to speak to ease their anguish. He knew everyone's struggles, their secret shames, their deepest fears, knowledge that made him both trusted confessor and quietly feared authority. Living in the rectory beside the church was his brother's daughter, Emma, a delicate girl with prematurely grey-streaked auburn hair and eyes that seemed far too old for her 14 years. She had arrived with her uncle as a mute, traumatized child who had allegedly witnessed unspeakable horrors during the crossing from Ireland. Stories whispered about ship fever, starvation, and death that had stolen her ability to speak. The townspeople pitied her, this silent waif who swept the church floors with mechanical precision and tended the small herb garden behind the rectory with an almost supernatural understanding of which plants would thrive in New England's harsh climate. Her aunt, Martha Fitzgerald, was a sharp-eyed woman with calloused hands and a face that seemed carved from granite. She managed the household with military precision, her Irish accent thick and unrefined compared to her brother-in-law's cultivated speech. She was known for her herb remedies and her ability to ease difficult childbirths, skills that had earned her grudging respect among the town's women, despite their religious differences. Her husband, Patrick, worked at the local sawmill, a burly man with massive hands and a reputation for reliability, maintaining the family's humble facade while contributing to their surprisingly detailed knowledge of every family's financial circumstances. What the people of Millbrook didn't realize was that the Fitzgerald family had been watching them, studying them, cataloging every whispered confession, every tearful admission, every secret shared in the supposed sanctity of the confessional booth. Father Fitzgerald kept meticulous notes, written in Gaelic script, that none of the English-speaking townsfolk could decipher, documenting not just sins, but family histories, financial struggles, romantic entanglements, medical ailments, and the intricate web of relationships that bound the small community together. It was information more valuable than gold, and the Fitzgeralds were about to discover just how profitable grief could be. The family had spent 5 years building their reputation and their intelligence network, waiting for the perfect moment to unveil Emma's supposed gift. They had watched families bury their loved ones, noted which deaths left the deepest scars, and carefully catalogued which survivors might be most susceptible to spiritual manipulation. The harsh winter of 1849 had been particularly brutal, claiming more lives than usual and leaving the community emotionally raw and desperate for any sign that their suffering had meaning. The transformation began on a bitter February morning when Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson collapsed during Sunday Mass. The church was packed despite the freezing temperature, breath visible in small clouds as the congregation huddled together for warmth. Mrs. Hutchinson sat in the third pew as she had every Sunday since her arrival in Millbrook 15 years earlier, but today her usual composed demeanor had cracked completely. She had been grieving her 6-year-old son, Thomas, who had died of scarlet fever just 3 weeks prior, and her wails of anguish echoed off the stone walls of the church like the cries of a wounded animal. The sound was heartbreaking, a mother's raw grief that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the community's composure. Other women began weeping in sympathy, and even the hardened mill workers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, confronted with a pain that transcended social boundaries. Father Fitzgerald had been delivering a sermon about eternal rest when Mrs. Hutchinson's composure finally shattered completely, her body racked with sobs that seemed to echo from the depths of her soul. As Father Fitzgerald moved from the pulpit to comfort her, his voice taking on the gentle cadence that had soothed so many grieving families, something unprecedented happened. Young Emma Fitzgerald suddenly spoke for the first time since her arrival in Millbrook 5 years earlier. The girl had been sitting in her usual place at the very back of the church, so still and silent that most people forgot she was there, when her clear, melodious voice cut through Mrs. Hutchinson's sobs like a knife through silk. "Thomas says not to cry, Mama. He says the angels are teaching him to read, just like you always wanted." The words came from Emma's lips in a voice that seemed too mature, too knowing for a 14-year-old girl. Her pale face had taken on an ethereal quality, her green eyes seeming to focus on something invisible to everyone else, her head tilted slightly as if listening to whispered words that only she could hear. "He says to tell you about the wooden horse he carved for Christmas, the one hidden under the floorboards in his room. He says he finished it just before the fever took him, and he wants his little sister Mary to have it." The entire congregation turned in stunned silence, the weight of collective attention falling on the previously unnoticed girl like a physical force. Mrs. Hutchinson's face went white as fresh snow, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of the pew in front of her. The wooden horse was real. Thomas had been secretly carving it as a gift for his younger sister, hiding it beneath loose floorboards where he thought no one would find it. Only Eleanor had discovered it while cleaning out his belongings, and she had told no one, not even her husband, about this final, heartbreaking evidence of her son's love and creativity. But Emma wasn't finished. Her voice continued with an otherworldly confidence that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. He says to remember the song you used to sing to him when the storms came, the one about the sailor who found his way home by following the stars. He says he can hear you singing it still, and it helps him not to be afraid in the new place where he lives now. Mrs. Hutchinson let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The lullaby was something she had invented herself, a simple melody with words she had made up to comfort Thomas during the violent thunderstorms that terrified him. She had never sung it for anyone else, never even hummed it where others might hear. The fact that this strange, silent girl somehow knew about this most intimate detail of her relationship with her dead son seemed impossible, miraculous, and terrifying all at once. The church had fallen so silent that the only sounds were the crackling of the wood stove and the soft whisper of wind through the gaps in the old building's walls. Emma's eyes remained fixed on some invisible presence, her expression serene and confident in a way that seemed almost supernatural. When she finally blinked and looked around at the sea of stunned faces, she appeared confused, as if awakening from a deep sleep with no memory of what had just occurred. Father Fitzgerald appeared as shocked as anyone by his niece's sudden manifestation of speech and apparent spiritual gift, his carefully controlled composure cracking for just a moment to reveal what looked like genuine surprise. But those with sharp eyes might have noticed how quickly he recovered, how smoothly he moved to support Emma as she swayed on her feet, and how his blue eyes seemed to catalogue every reaction in the congregation with the precision of a man taking inventory. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "Young Emma has been touched by divine grace, a vessel chosen to bring comfort to those who mourn." His words were carefully measured, establishing a narrative that would frame everything that followed. We must pray for guidance in understanding this blessed gift that has been bestowed upon our humble community. But what nobody saw were the years of preparation that had led to this moment. The countless hours Emma had spent memorizing details about every family in Millbrook, practicing the exact tone and cadence that would make her performance most convincing. They had been waiting for the perfect opportunity, the right combination of raw grief and community vulnerability that would make their elaborate deception not just believable, but irresistible. Word of the miracle spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire in a dry forest, carried on the lips of every person who had witnessed Emma's impossible knowledge of Thomas Hutchinson's secret wooden horse and his mother's private lullaby. By evening, 3 more families had arrived at the rectory, their faces etched with desperate hope and trembling hands clutching small offerings, a silver thimble, a handful of coins, a treasured family Bible, begging Emma to contact their deceased relatives. Each subsequent session seemed to confirm the miraculous nature of Emma's gift. For the Kowalski family, who had lost their patriarch to a mill accident 6 months earlier, Emma delivered a message about a hidden cache of tools that the old man had supposedly saved for his grandson's 18th birthday. The tools were exactly where she said they would be, wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the floorboards of the barn, along with a note written in the old man's shaky handwriting expressing his hopes for the boy's future. For the recently widowed Sarah McKenna, Emma provided comfort from her husband's spirit, including specific details about their wedding night that no outsider could possibly have known. The way he had nervously fumbled with her dress buttons, the Irish blessing he had whispered in her ear, the tiny scar on his shoulder from a childhood accident that she used to trace with her finger. The accuracy was so uncanny that Sarah collapsed in grateful tears, pressing a silver locket into Emma's hands as payment for the precious gift of knowing her husband's love continued beyond the grave. As winter gave way to a reluctant New England spring, Emma's reputation grew beyond the borders of Millbrook. Families traveled from as far as Boston and Hartford, bringing increasingly generous donations and ever more desperate pleas to contact their lost loved ones. The girl seemed to grow stronger with each session, her voice gaining confidence, her visions becoming more elaborate and detailed, her ability to provide exactly the comfort each family needed becoming almost supernatural in its precision. The Fitzgerald family's operation had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence-gathering network that would have impressed even the most experienced confidence men of the era. Patrick would frequent the town's taverns and the workers' boarding houses, his friendly demeanor and reputation for honesty encouraging loose-tongued men to share stories about their families, their neighbors, their financial struggles, and their most closely guarded secrets. He had developed a remarkable ability to ask the right questions without seeming intrusive, drawing out information that men thought they were simply sharing with a sympathetic friend. Martha joined the women's quilting circles, church social events, and birthing rooms, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea, and where women revealed details about their families that they would never share with their husbands. She had cultivated a reputation as a wise woman and healer, someone who could be trusted with intimate secrets about marriages, pregnancies, family disputes, and financial worries. Her herb garden provided the perfect excuse to visit homes throughout the community, ostensibly to gather medicinal plants, but actually to observe family dynamics and gather intelligence. Most crucially, Father Fitzgerald had expanded his influence beyond simple religious services, offering special confessions, counseling sessions, and deathbed visits that gave him unprecedented access to the community's most guarded secrets. He had positioned himself as not just a spiritual advisor, but as a keeper of last wishes, a confidant for dying patriots, and a counselor for families torn apart by tragedy. His confessional booth had become a repository for information about hidden debts, secret affairs, family treasures, and the intimate details that defined each family's private world. They had developed an intricate system of signals and codes that allowed them to coordinate Emma's performances with mathematical precision. A particular arrangement of flowers on the altar indicated which family would be visiting that day. The way Emma positioned her hands during a communion with the dead signaled which prepared script she was following. Even her apparent trances were carefully choreographed performances, designed to convince observers that they were witnessing something beyond human comprehension, while actually following a complex set of predetermined cues and responses. The physical staging of Emma's sessions had been crafted with theatrical precision. The girl would sit in Father Fitzgerald's study, surrounded by religious artifacts and flickering candles that created an atmosphere of mystery and reverence. Her pale complexion and ethereal appearance were enhanced by carefully chosen clothing and subtle cosmetic techniques that made her seem almost translucent in the dim light. Every detail, from the temperature of the room to the positioning of furniture, had been designed to create an environment where grieving families would be most susceptible to spiritual manipulation. But the scheme's success began attracting unwanted attention from quarters the Fitzgeralds hadn't anticipated. Reverend Samuel Hartwell of the First Protestant Church had initially dismissed Emma's abilities as Catholic superstition, but as his own parishioners began defecting to attend her sessions, he started conducting his own investigation. Unknown to the Fitzgeralds, Hartwell had started documenting the specific information Emma claimed to receive from the dead, cross-referencing it with what he knew about each family's private affairs and noting discrepancies that troubled his methodical mind. Meanwhile, Dr. Ezekiel Thorne, the town's only physician, was growing suspicious about Emma's knowledge of medical details that no child should possess. When she accurately described the final symptoms of patients he had treated in private, the specific progression of lung disease, the particular way certain fevers manifested, the exact location of tumors that hadn't been visible to the naked eye, he began to suspect that something far more earthly than divine intervention was at work. The first crack in the Fitzgeralds' perfect facade appeared in late March, when Emma made a crucial mistake during a session with the McBride family. She claimed their deceased father was concerned about a specific business deal involving a lumber contract with a company in Springfield, warning that the deal would fail within the month and leave the family financially ruined. The message was delivered with Emma's usual confidence and included specific details about the contract terms that seemed impossible for her to know. The problem was that old Sean McBride had died 6 months before the business opportunity even existed. The lumber contract hadn't been proposed until 3 weeks after his death, and the Springfield company hadn't even been incorporated until January. It was information that Father Fitzgerald had gleaned from a recent confession by Sean's son Timothy, who had been agonizing over whether to accept the risky business proposition, but which the priest had carelessly attributed to the wrong source when briefing Emma for her performance. Young Timothy McBride, a sharp-minded 18-year-old who had inherited his father's head for business, along with his suspicious nature, immediately recognized the impossibility of Emma's message. His father couldn't have known about a lumber contract that hadn't been proposed until 3 weeks after his death, much less provided specific details about a company that hadn't existed during his lifetime. The error was so glaring, so obviously impossible, that Timothy felt as if a cold hand had gripped his heart as he realized the implications. When Timothy quietly shared his concerns with Dr. Thorne during a chance encounter at Morrison's general store, the two men discovered they had both been harboring similar doubts about Emma's alleged abilities. Dr. Thorne's medical training had made him particularly sensitive to the girl's impossible knowledge of symptoms and diseases, while Timothy's business acumen had alerted him to anachronisms in the financial information Emma claimed to receive from beyond the grave. Their investigation began cautiously, with informal conversations and careful observation, but quickly revealed a disturbing pattern that neither man had fully grasped when examining Emma's claims in isolation. Many of the messages from beyond contained information that had been shared in recent confessions, gossip sessions, or medical consultations, information that should have been known only to the participants and possibly to Father Fitzgerald in his role as spiritual counselor and community confidant. More troubling still, they discovered that several families who had received messages from Emma had subsequently made financial decisions that benefited the Catholic Church or the Fitzgerald family directly. The McCready widow had donated her late husband's valuable carpentry tools to the church after Emma claimed he wanted them used for God's work. The Brennan family had hired Patrick Fitzgerald to repair their barn after their deceased son allegedly requested it from beyond the grave, paying premium rates for work that other men could have performed for half the cost. Dr. Thorne began keeping detailed records of his medical practice, noting which patients' conditions he had discussed with Father Fitzgerald during last rites, family counseling sessions, or private consultations about terminal diagnoses. The correlation between his confidential medical knowledge and Emma's subsequent revelations became impossible to ignore. When Emma accurately described the hidden cancer that had killed Martha Sinclair, including details about the tumor's location, the progression of symptoms, and even the specific pain medications Dr. Thorne had prescribed. The investigation took on new urgency when Dr. Thorne began reviewing the medical histories of people who had died in Millbrook over the past 2 years. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. A pattern of deaths among people who had either challenged the Fitzgerald family's growing influence or possessed information that could potentially expose their operation. The deaths appeared natural on the surface: heart failure, sudden fever, mysterious wasting diseases, but they shared common symptoms consistent with certain types of poisoning that would have been virtually undetectable with the limited medical knowledge of the time. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, the Protestant minister's wife, had died suddenly after publicly questioning whether Emma's abilities were truly divine in origin. Her symptoms, severe stomach pain, weakness, and eventual cardiac arrest, were consistent with arsenic poisoning administered in small doses over several weeks. Thomas Brennan, the young man whose spirit had supposedly requested that his family hire Patrick Fitzgerald, had died just 2 days after expressing doubts about Emma's authenticity to his mother. His rapid decline from apparent good health to fatal fever matched the progression of mercury poisoning. The situation reached a boiling point in early April when Emma claimed to receive a message from Benjamin Fuller, a mill worker who had allegedly died in a machinery accident the previous week. According to Emma, Benjamin's spirit was warning the town about dangerous working conditions that would claim more lives unless immediate changes were made to the mill's safety procedures. The message was so detailed and technically accurate that it could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the mill's operations and the specific hazards that threatened workers' lives daily. The problem was that Benjamin Fuller was still alive. Dr. Thorne had treated him for minor injuries the previous week, and the man was very much breathing when Emma delivered his supposed posthumous message to a room full of grieving mill workers and their families. When confronted with this impossibility, Father Fitzgerald claimed that Emma must have been receiving a prophetic vision of Benjamin's future death rather than communication with his spirit. But the explanation rang hollow to anyone with functioning critical thinking skills. For Dr. Thorne and Timothy McBride, Benjamin Fuller's premature death was the final piece of evidence they needed to confirm their suspicions about the Fitzgerald family's elaborate deception. But their investigation had also uncovered something even more disturbing than simple fraud. Evidence that the family was willing to commit murder to protect their operation and enhance their credibility as spiritual intermediaries. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, the two men faced a terrible dilemma that would define the rest of their lives. Exposing the Fitzgeralds would destroy the faith and hope of dozens of grieving families who had found genuine comfort in Emma's messages. But allowing the family to continue their operation would almost certainly result in more deaths as they worked to eliminate potential threats and create prophetic fulfillments of Emma's predictions. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next as we uncover the true depths of the Fitzgerald family's sinister operations. Armed with evidence of the Fitzgeralds' deception and their growing suspicion of something far more sinister, Dr. Thorne and Timothy McBride found themselves trapped in a nightmarish situation that tested every moral principle they held dear. Exposing the family would destroy the faith and hope of dozens of grieving families who had found comfort in Emma's messages, shattering their belief not just in the girl's abilities, but in the very possibility of life after death. Many had made significant life changes based on supposed communications from their deceased loved ones, changes that had brought them peace and purpose in the midst of overwhelming grief. The widow Patterson had remarried because her first husband allegedly gave his blessing through Emma, finally allowing herself to find happiness after 2 years of mourning. The Kowalski family had moved their elderly grandmother into their home because their dead grandfather had requested it, creating a multi-generational household that had brought joy to the old woman's final years. The Sullivan children had chosen to keep their father's struggling farm instead of selling it and moving to the city, inspired by messages that encouraged them to honor their family's agricultural legacy. Revealing the truth would shatter these families all over again, forcing them to confront the possibility that their most treasured spiritual experiences had been nothing more than elaborate lies designed to separate them from their money and manipulate their emotions. The psychological damage could be irreparable, potentially destroying the mental health of people who had already endured more loss than any human being should have to bear. But their investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing than simple fraud. Father Fitzgerald's meticulous notes, which Dr. Thorne had glimpsed during a medical call to the rectory to treat Emma for what appeared to be a minor illness, contained information that went far beyond what any confessor should know or record. There were detailed family trees dating back generations, comprehensive lists of debts and assets that would have required access to private financial records, detailed accounts of extramarital affairs and illegitimate children, and carefully compiled profiles of which widows might be most vulnerable to financial manipulation. The priest wasn't just collecting spiritual confessions. He was building a comprehensive intelligence database about every family in the region, complete with psychological profiles, financial assessments, and strategic recommendations for how each household could be most effectively exploited. The scope of information gathering was so extensive that it suggested the Fitzgeralds had been planning their operation for years before Emma's first miracle, systematically infiltrating every aspect of community life to gather the intelligence they would need for their elaborate deception. More troubling still were the recent entries in the priest's journal, which Dr. Thorne had managed to read during a moment when Father Fitzgerald was distracted by Emma's apparent illness, and detailed observations about training additional vessels for God's work. Emma wasn't their only young relative. They had mentioned cousins still in Ireland, who could be brought over once the American operation was fully established and generating sufficient income to support multiple spiritual mediums. The breaking point came when Mrs. Catherine Brennan arrived at Dr. Thorne's office in hysterics, clutching a letter she claimed her deceased husband had dictated through Emma during a private session that had cost her nearly a month's income. The letter contained specific instructions about where Brennan had supposedly hidden a cache of gold coins before his death, complete with detailed descriptions of landmarks and measurements that seemed impossible for Emma to have invented. Catherine had spent her life savings hiring men to excavate her property based on these instructions, convinced that her husband's spirit was trying to provide for his family from beyond the grave. She had borrowed money against her home to fund the increasingly extensive excavation, following the letter's instructions to dig deeper and search wider areas. When the initial attempts yielded nothing, the work had continued for weeks, turning her modest property into a landscape of holes and trenches that resembled a battlefield more than a family homestead. When Dr. Thorne examined the letter, he recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Father Fitzgerald, written in the same careful script he had seen in medical documents, church records, and the journal entries he had glimpsed in the rectory. The priest had apparently convinced the grieving widow that her husband's spirit had taken control of Emma's hand to write the message directly, providing proof of supernatural communication that was actually nothing more than a carefully crafted forgery. The non-existent treasure hunt had cost Catherine Brennan everything she owned, and the loan she had secured to continue the excavation came from Patrick Fitzgerald himself, offered at an interest rate that would ensure she could never repay it. The Fitzgeralds had not only stolen her money through false hope, they had positioned themselves to claim her property when she inevitably defaulted on the impossible debt. It was a level of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple fraud, representing a systematic destruction of a vulnerable woman's entire life for financial gain. As Dr. Thorne and Timothy McBride delved deeper into the Fitzgerald family's operations, they discovered that Catherine Brennan's situation was not unique. Several other families had received similar spiritual guidance that had led them to make catastrophic